Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air. Our program is presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. It's the 42nd week of 2014. Aware was established 13 years ago, after the 9/11 attacks, by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East. Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and control of them gives the U.S. an advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. The U.S. invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were as much about imperial control as Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939. This week marks the 13th anniversary of the American invasion of Afghanistan. In recent American history, 13 years also marks the space of time between the outbreak of World War II and the inauguration of President Eisenhower in 1952, or between the election of President Roosevelt and the U.S. atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or between the election of President Kennedy and the resignation of President Nixon, a significant space of time. We have always been at war with East Asia, wrote George Orwell in his novel 1984. 13 years of U.S. soldiers killing men, women, and children in Afghanistan followed 10 years of the Soviet war on that country, a war that was prompted by the Jimmy Carter administration and became a factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union. So far, the effects of war in Afghanistan have not been so dire for the United States, but the U.S. continues to torture that wretched country, and the blowback on us has yet to be determined. Why? The real reason for the Bush-Obama war on Afghanistan is not the war on terror, which is just an excuse, propaganda to mislead the only enemy the U.S. government really fears, the U.S. public, who ended the war in Vietnam and drove two presidents from office. And there's no difference in policy between those two administrations, despite Obama's pretending that there was to get elected. President Obama this week is ordering air attacks in Syria and Iraq and drone strikes in Pakistan. In Iraq, the U.S. has killed hundreds of thousands of people in this decade. The president who promised hope and change has become the fourth president in a row to bomb Iraq. He has now bombed 8 countries. Bush only bombed 6. Like President Clinton and the Bushes, Obama says that he's killing people to fight terrorism, in this case the ISIS group, which was originally funded and supported by principal U.S. allies in the region, from Saudi Arabia to Turkey, just as the Taliban was originally funded by the Carter administration. Obama says he's killing more people in the Mideast because ISIS threatens Americans and what he called American interests. That's partly true, because the principal American interest is the control of Mideast energy resources. But that's in the interest of only 1% of Americans, the rich, who profit from U.S. control of the world economy. Obama's killing is called fighting terrorism because terrorism is the name the U.S. gives to the armed resistance, which of course can be vicious and brutal, to the generations-long U.S. invasion of the region. Even the greatest example of terrorism, the crimes of 9/11-2001, were counterattacks. Al-Qaeda said they were launched for 3 reasons. 1, Israel's oppression of the Palestinians. 2, the Clinton administration's sanctions on Iraq, which killed 500,000 children, and Clinton's Secretary of State said it was worth it. And 3, Saudi Arabia's allowing U.S. troops into the Muslim Holy Land. The Obama administration is now trying to rally the Sunni alliance, principally Saudi Arabia and Israel, with the threat of ISIS, hoping to continue to use it against the Shia alliance, Iran and Syria, with Russia and China in the background. But the U.S. has no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests, as has been said. And those interests are the interests of the U.S. 1% in controlling the Eurasian economy by means of controlling Mideast energy resources. the world's greatest material prize, as the State Department put it in 1945. It's a rational calculation on the assumption that human survival is not particularly significant in comparison with short-term power and wealth for the U.S. to act as it does. It's nothing new. These themes resonate through history. The difference today is that in this age of nuclear weapons, it's only that the stakes are enormously higher. If the U.S. were not controlled by the 1% wedded to the military-industrial establishment, and if common sense were the operative principle, it would make sense to refrain from any military action, leaving it to the Iraqi and Syrian people to deal with these new oppressors, perhaps with local powers' support. The record shows that U.S. military actions in the Middle East produce no good for the people of the region, but rather lots of harm. It's not in the interest of the vast majority of Americans to kill people around the world for the profits of the 1%, but that's what the American government has done, up to and including President Obama's administration. In 1967, the civil rights leader Martin Luther King admitted with dismay that, quote, "The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government." Tragically, nothing has changed in the intervening years. American presidents have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings in the last 50 years, mostly civilians. Not to spread peace and democracy, as they claim, but to ensure U.S. economic control, as the rest of the world recognizes. They have made the U.S. government the most feared and hated in the world. One of the first and most read books about the 9/11 attacks pointed out accurately, quote, "Everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, there's a really easy way. Stop participating in it." In much of the world, the U.S. is regarded as the leading terrorist state, and with good reason. The U.S. has 1,000 military bases outside its borders. Russia and China have none. The U.S. Special Operations Command, a 63,000-member private army that reports to the President's National Security Council, not to Congress, is active by its own admission in 124 countries around the world. Its activities include rendition, that's kidnapping, enhanced interrogation, that's torture, and disposition, that's murder. Read about the CIA's disposition matrix. Last year, President Obama told White House aides, "Turns out I'm really good at killing people. Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine." In his Terror Tuesday sessions, as the administration explained to the New York Times, Obama has selected, from baseball cards presented to him by CIA Director John Brennan, thousands of people to be killed. Obama's drone strikes alone have resulted in 5,000 deaths, including 200 child corpses. The unavoidable conclusion is that the Obama administration wants war in the Mideast, not just for the profits of the arms makers, although that's an important consideration for the U.S. government, but because otherwise there's no propaganda justification for U.S. military control of the region. You're watching Aware on the Air. Aware wants to stop the child killers in the White House and the Congress in their efforts around the world on behalf of the American 1%. We try to do that by exposing the real story of what's going on over against the false account that the U.S. media, a creation of big business, want you to believe. We'll challenge that false account tonight with commentaries by Ron Zoke, Karen Aram on the Pentagon and climate change, David Johnson on confusion in the Mideast, and Karen Evans-Levy on local political events. And we'll begin with Ron Zoke on...
Big mistakes.
Thank you.
Big mistakes. The biggest ones in recent history, I think, but I won't have time to support that thesis very thoroughly, and I don't expect to really convince anyone in the time available. So far as this country is concerned, it is the American wars in the Middle East, the attempt to subdue and dominate that area, the real motives for which we can only speculate, but there's more and more, I think, admission that it was for control of the petroleum resources of the Middle East, and not about the great crusade for freedom, democracy, and human rights that we were told about some years ago as we were going to war 13, 14 years ago. So the other one which will be even more controversial, I hope, or I fear, I'm sorry, is Zionism and what happened to it. I'm afraid it's coming to a tragic conclusion in the form that it took after World War II, 1946. Originally, early on, it seemed like a good idea, a idealistic move to provide Jews with a refuge where they would not be persecuted and killed. But I'm afraid it has become a poison pill that will eventually infect and possibly destroy the religion of Judaism itself. Because it has taken this aggressive turn, and that, it seems to me, will have a very bad outcome in the longer run. So the way they're trying to deal with it is becoming ever more warlike and aggressive, and that seems to me is a big mistake in the longer view of history. But again, that would be very controversial and difficult to support. I want to bring to you a few comments. Interesting piece by James Risen, the New York Times reporter, who is currently being prosecuted and persecuted by the Obama administration for not revealing the sources of some of the stories that he's written. And he's promised some people confidentiality and is being coerced to reveal where he got those stories. And it's turning into quite a confrontation between Mr. Risen and the government that advertised itself early on as the most open and transparent in American history. Here's a story by James Risen in the New York Times, October 12th. Not long after American forces defeated the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein in 2003, caravans of trucks began to arrive at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington on a regular basis, unloading a unusual cargo, pellets of shrink-wrapped $100 bills. They were kind of brick-shaped.
Yep.
The cash withdrawn from Iraqi government accounts held in the United States was loaded onto Air Force C-17 transport planes bound for Baghdad, where the Bush administration hoped it would provide a quick financial infusion for Iraq's new government and the country's battered economy. So what happened over the next year and a half, $12 billion to $14 billion was sent to Iraq in the airlift, and an additional $5 billion was sent by electronic transfer. Exactly what happened to that money after it arrived in Baghdad has become one of the many unanswered questions from the chaotic days of the American occupation, where billions were flowing into the country from the United States and corruption was rampant. Finding the answer became the first the job and then the obsession of Stuart Bowen, a friend of from Texas of President George Bush, who in 2004 was appointed to serve as a special inspector general to investigate corruption and waste in Iraq. Before his office was finally shut down last year, Mr. Bowen believed he might have succeeded only partly in that mission, but for years, Mr. Bowen could not account, still apparently cannot account, for billions more until his investigators finally made a breakthrough, discovering that 1.2 billion to 1.6 billion had been stolen and moved to a bunker in rural Lebanon for safekeeping. I don't know how the money got to Lebanon, Mr. Bowen said. If I knew that, we would have made more progress on the case, and so on. Spokesmen for the FBI and the CIA have declined to pursue this. They declined to comment for this article also. For the Coalition Professional Authority, an advantage of using cash from the development fund instead of money appropriated by Congress for Iraq was that there was a lot of rules governing its use, that is the money from the government, This was Iraqi money and not anything from American taxpayers, so they didn't have any rules about how it could be distributed or spent. Meanwhile, another consequence of the war, the U.S. Air Force is now being probed for scrapping costly planes bought for Afghans. The Department of Defense sold nearly $486 million of airplanes for $32,000 as scrap metal this week, according to the Week. A U.S. government watchdog agency has asked the Air Force to explain why it destroyed 16 aircraft initially bought for the Afghan Air Force and turned them into $32,000 of scrap metal instead of finding other ways to salvage nearly $500 million in U.S. funds spent on the program. So, consequences of war in the Middle East. There are a number of points that could be made about this. I'll go on to comment about what's happening in Ukraine if I have another minute. This is from Yahoo News, where you can occasionally find things that you will never find in the corporate media otherwise. From Kiev, Ukraine, clashes broke out Tuesday between demonstrators and police in front of Ukraine's parliament as Kiev, as deputies inside repeatedly voted down proposals to recognize a contentious World War II-era Ukrainian partisan group as national heroes. This group, Svoboda, which fought on the side of the Nazis against the Russians during World War II, now wants to be proclaimed as national heroes by the Ukrainian parliament. They're demonstrating outside the building and
to oppose it?
No, to support the idea. The parliament is not voting for it, and they're trying to pressure the parliament into declaring Svoboda national heroes. Later, masked men attacked and threw smoke grenades at lines of police outside Parliament as lawmakers met inside. The Interior Ministry said 36 people were detained by police. The unrest overshadowed the passage of laws the government hopes will contain the galloping corruption that has long hindered Ukraine's sclerotic economy. President Petro Poroshenko urged lawmakers to keep up the fight against corruption, a problem that he equated with terrorism, and so on. So
You should know, right?
yeah, the Russians have a memory of this, actually, even if Americans don't, for the most part. And Lvov in western Ukraine is the only place in the world now, apparently, where swastikas are being openly paraded through the streets by these ultra-nationalist and pro-fascist groups, Ukrainians. But you're not hearing any of this from the corporate media. I'll come back to some domestic issues that I think are also big mistakes later if there's time. But for now, I'll stop.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to Karen Aram to talk about the Pentagon.
Can I make a comment about Ron's?
Sure.
Yeah, you know, one of the, besides the all the shrink wrap pallets of $100 bills that were sent to Iraq, one of the other big mysteries is what happened to all of Iraq's art treasures that were looted right after the invasion.
Oh, yeah.
Considering the United States military controlled every single land, sea, and air route out of the country, and no Iraqi had the money to purchase this, again, they just disappeared. And to this day, no accounting of them.
Like the art that turned up in the Swiss apartment a couple of months ago that had been looted by the Nazis, you know.
Indeed.
Give it another generation or two, they'll probably turn up again. Karen, tell us about the Pentagon.
Well,
are they doing well in this, out of all of this?
Well, a couple months ago, before ISIS, I think before ISIS, Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! Interviewed a woman who was the producer of a documentary on climate change, and it was to be presented on HBO. And they did since win an Emmy Award for their documentary on climate change. Now, I only saw 2 episodes. The first episode had Harrison Ford marching in very obnoxiously and telling the Indonesian head of Agriculture or Ministry of Forestry, whatever, that they had to do something about all the palm oil plants that were creating all the climate problems. And then I watched another episode, and they had Thomas Friedman in Syria, and he was talking about how it was climate change that created the water and food shortages that brought about all of the people fleeing from the villages into the cities, and then brought about the uprising against a government that was doing nothing to help the people. Now, I have no doubt it's accurate, okay? Because it's when people are without food and without water that they tend to rise up against their oppressive governments. But he then goes on to paint them as rebels fighting climate change. And at that time, we were going through a lot of concern about supporting various different rebel groups and arming them to fight the government, because we really didn't know who these rebel groups were or who they represented, given that they were so diverse. So anyway, I stopped watching that documentary because clearly it was a propaganda tool and really had little to do with the real problems of climate change. This morning, I was delighted when I went through my New York Times headlines and noted the Pentagon showing concern over climate change. And then I read it.
Yeah.
Now, yes. and my skepticism was rewarded as usual. The Pentagon on Monday evidently released a report asserting decisively that climate change poses an immediate threat to national security, with increased risks from terrorism, infectious disease, global poverty, and food shortages. It also predicted rising demand for military disaster responses as extreme weather creates more global humanitarian crisis. The report then lays out a roadmap to show how the military will adapt to rising sea levels, more violent storms, and widespread droughts. The Defense Department will begin by integrating plans for climate change risks across all of its operations, from war games and strategic military planning situations to a rethinking of the movement of supplies. Now, this Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel was speaking at a meeting of defense ministers, and he'll be speaking in Peru. And one of the things I need to point out is that when Mr. Hagel was the, what was he? He was the representative of Nebraska. That was back when he was a Republican. He was one of those that was instrumental. He was a senator from Nebraska. He was instrumental, and he played a crucial role in blocking the U.S. from taking part in the world's first climate change treaty. So, that was making sure that the Senate would never ratify the Kyoto Protocol. So this is quite a turnaround for Mr. Hagel, or is it?
Or is it?
That's
Good.
my point. Now, there's so much throughout this report, okay, 2 pages. I'm not going to go through each detail, because what it really represents is reading between the lines. One thing I do point out is that before the Pentagon's response to climate change focused chiefly on preparing military installations to adapt to its effects, like protecting coastal naval bases from rising sea levels, this new report, however, calls on the military to incorporate climate change into broader strategic thinking about high-risk regions. For example, the ways in which drought and food shortages might set off political unrest in the Middle East and Africa. Gee, what a shock. Now, they also talk a lot about, I'm not going to bore you with all the details. The article is on the New York Times, and I'm sorry I've forgotten the title. They quote Marcus King, who's an expert on climate change and international affairs at George Washington University, which that's my alma mater. It's an arm of specific organizations related to the government. The Islamic State, he claims, often referred to as ISIS, has seized scarce water resources to enhance its power and influence. That's what he has been saying. My whole point of this is that they're talking about more money for the Pentagon, and they're calling it like fighting climate change, but what they're really doing is they're gearing up for more military intervention, and now we've got this new terrorist replacing ISIS, and it's called climate change. we're doing nothing really to alleviate. Okay, one of the things they are going to focus on, okay, at the meeting that will take place, they will be writing it up with the UN, that it's going to be a United Nations agreement to be signed next year in Paris that would require the world's largest producers of planet-warming carbon pollution to slash their emissions. I just hope that the U.S. is the first one on the list and not the last.
And that the military-industrial complex, which produces an awful lot of carbon,
Well, exactly, exactly.
is not
exactly.
exempt from the carbon. Yeah.
Exactly, Karen. So watch out. Now we have our new threat.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Karen. You're watching Aware on the Air, and we'll turn to David Johnson on the question of confusion in the Middle East. Is there
Yes.
some confusion, David?
Oh, indeed. I mean, the big problem with Middle East events is getting reliable information. I mean, especially
Yes.
if you live here in the United States,
Right.
because we have a corporate-controlled media that basically filters and suppresses information on a daily basis to us. It's very difficult to get information. You have to go on the internet, and even going on the internet, it's difficult to find reliable reports. But a couple of good ones I found this week, one from The Guardian and another one actually from a man named Ajumu Baraka, who is actually a member, he's a human rights expert. He lives in Atlanta, Georgia. He's an American, and he's actually a member of the Green Party USA Shadow Cabinet. And he wrote a really excellent article here that I just got a couple days ago, which pretty much goes right to the cuts through all the crap, all the BS propaganda, and pretty much outlines what's really going on. I mean, basically, the title of his article is "ISIS: Double Standards in the Fight in Kobani," and he starts out the article by saying that while ISIS moves to slaughter Kurds in Kobani, the current situation is part of the cynical farce that is the fight against ISIS. Remember, ISIS just a year ago was touted as being freedom fighters. John McCain personally went over to Syria and posed for it with a photograph with the leadership of ISIS. Now, I mean, depending on what you've read or seen or heard, ISIS is either another Frankenstein monster that our State Department has created and now has gone off the reservation, so to speak, or it's still doing its part. Basically, it's part of the plan to destabilize the Middle East. Because let's face it, even though we hear our political leadership from President Obama on down constantly talk about how they're so concerned about human rights, they're so concerned about peace in the Middle East and elsewhere, nothing could be further from the truth. Because the real objective of both Democrat and Republican politicians that are elected, for the most part, most of them, with corporate money, is that they want instability in the Middle East because it's part of an old colonial ruling technique called divide and conquer. The more chaos that's there, the less opportunities that people in the Middle East can actually govern themselves. And it makes it easier for a power like the United States or Britain or the EU to basically go in, take control in the midst of all this chaos that's created so that they can secure oil reserves and other energy resources. And the purpose of this is not so that we as Americans or other citizens of, say, Britain or the European Union can have secure, stable, and oil supplies and cheaper prices. Just the opposite's the case. Who they're actually doing it for is to benefit the international oil companies so they can keep prices high, so that they can manipulate the markets and stuff to basically rob us even more than what they have been. It's really interesting because this article goes on to say that the U.S. of course this is the interesting tactic that's been used in recent years too, is they're always trying to create a smokescreen to intervene militarily somewhere. The smokescreen is humanitarian assistance. We have to go in and stop this evil force of ISIS that's causing humanitarian problems. I mean, which is true, but just keep in mind that the question is who created ISIS, and who really, if you think about it, how could they operate so effectively like they have if they didn't have at least some cooperation from Turkey, the bordering area of where this conflict's going on in northeast Syria, northwestern Iraq, and which borders the southern border of Turkey. But what's really interesting is that there's two different groups of Kurds. You've got the Kurds in northern Iraq that were basically set up by the U.S. military after the invasion, which, by the way, happens to control 45% of Iraq's oil reserves. Those are the ones that the U.S. government flew in all sorts of air support for not too long ago, defending them against ISIS. But we have another group of Kurds who are actually independent, who live on northeastern Syria. And they basically have set up their own independent Kurdish self-governance. And it's a really interesting, they're called the Kurdistan Workers' Party. And what they've done is they've set up a series of local governments in which they have democratically elected representatives, the people that live there, and there's emphasis made on always having a Kurd, a Christian, and a Sunni Arab as part of the self-governing representation. And it's really interesting because they've been actually fighting ISIS. They've been fighting ISIS more than the other Kurds in Iraq, and now that they're basically having a standoff in Kobani, all of a sudden it seems like our government is just saying how they're helpless. They can't do anything to help these Kurds. Well, these Kurds don't sit on 45% of the oil reserves of Iraq, and they also aren't controlled by anyone but themselves. So this, gives a real insight into what the real purpose of U.S. foreign policy is. And just to finish up here, just to give you an idea of what their self-government is like, besides guarantee a equal ethnic balance in their local councils, is that they basically, this area is called Rahavi, and they basically chased out the Syrian army of President Assad in 2011, this area. And despite hostility of all of its neighbors, Rahavi has not only maintained its independence, but is a remarkable democratic experiment. Popular assemblies have been created as the ultimate decision-making bodies, councils selected with careful ethnic balance, and also besides the ethnic balance, they also make sure that at least one of the three representatives in the governing council is a woman. And there are also women in youth councils. And it's a very, very interesting development here in the Middle East. But what's interesting is nobody's heard about this. Nobody's talking about this. I just found out about this a couple days ago. So it's like one of the most well-kept secrets of what's a possibility for a future peaceful, democratic Middle East. Of course, it appears as if our own government is going to basically serve up these Kurds for ISIS to slaughter and enslave. Again, just showing you what the real purpose, unfortunately, of our foreign policy is, in which we, the American people, have got to try to put a stop to. We've got to tell our representatives to stop involving our soldiers, our money in these interventions in other parts of the world, especially the Middle East, that's not benefiting the American people, but only a tiny percent of the American people. That's the 1% wealthy class who are causing havoc in this country as well. So, I mean, this is what I think we need to look at. And again, you're not going to find this information by watching NBC, ABC, CNN, or Fox News. I can guarantee you that. You've got to go on the internet. It takes a little effort, but if we want to live in a democracy, we need to know the truth. We need to find out accurate information so that we can, the people, can make accurate decisions.
Very good.
Thank you very much, David. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go now to Karen Evans-Levy on some local events and comments on what you've heard so far.
What was the name of the region again? The Democratic?
It's Rahavi.
Rahavi. Very good. Thank you.
Rojava.
Very good. Thank you. So I can look it up.
That's spelled with an R or a W?
R.
R. Very good. So I just want to mention some local events that are coming up, and the first one is Roy Zimmerman will be in town and giving a concert at Allen Hall on campus. He has 13 albums over the last 20 years, and he has brought the sting of satire to the struggle for peace and social justice. Roy Zimmerman is also a featured blogger on the Huffington Post. The Roy Zimmerman concert will be at Allen Hall on the University of Illinois Urbana campus Wednesday, October 15th, 2014 at 7 p.m. and that's at 1005 West Gregory in Urbana. The concert is free, but bring money for CDs. They're really good CDs. I've got many of them. For example, the lyrics to his Hello NSA song is, hello NSA, I just called to say I love you because you really listen. When I'm on the phone, now I never feel alone because you're out there with your headphones and you really listen. So go see Roy Zimmerman. He's got some really great songs and you will have a great time, and also it's just great entertainment. There will be another political candidate debate. This one will be featuring the candidates for Congress in the 13th District, the Democrat Ann Callis and the incumbent Republican Rodney Davis. Will be at 7 p.m. October 16th at WILL TV, Channel 12. Evidently, you can't go there in person, but you can join the conversation online and on Twitter. And it's hashtag IL13th, the number 13th 2014. And so join that. Evidently, it's kind of weird. The debate is actually sponsored by WILL, the News Gazette, WCIA, and the League of Women Voters of Champaign County, and the NAACP of Champaign County. The WCIA news anchor, Jennifer Roscoe, will actually be the moderator. And the questioning will be done by a panel of journalists, I use that in quotes, including Tom Kasich of the News Gazette and the Illinois Public Media News reporter Hannah Meisel. So again, that's on, it's 7 p.m. on October 16th on Channel 12. And they will do it live, both on the television and on radio, but join them on Twitter. Okay. There's another event called How Immigrants Became Americans, and this is the case of the Poles, Polish people. Monday, October 20th at noon at the Center for Advanced Study. It's the first floor seminar room of the CAS building, and that's at 912 West Illinois Street in Urbana. And Jim Barrett will be the speaker there. Department of History. So, also, I just want to remind everybody that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So look for some of those events happening on campus. That's really important. In November, there will be another social justice film screening from the Unitarian Universalists in Champaign-Urbana. And this one will be called The Square. That's November 3rd at 6:30 p.m. at the Channing Murray Foundation, 1209 West Oregon Street in Urbana. A short description of the film is that The Square is a revolutionary film about change and the power of people. We encourage you to share these inspirational stories with your own community, and it's about bringing this film to theaters all across the country. And I think it's about I'm pretty sure it's about anyway, go see it. It should be really good. All the other, I won't, it doesn't say that it's about that, but I'm just going to assume it's about the Arab Spring, but I could be wrong. There's another event called Institutions of Immigration Removal, the Rise of the American Deportation Regime, which should be really, really interesting. Wednesday, November 12th at noon at the Center for Advanced Study, again at 912 West Illinois Street. Emily Pope Obeda from the Department of History will be the speaker for that. And then in December, there will be another social justice film screening, How to Survive a Plague. And that's more about AIDS and stuff like that. I just want to mention a couple things, talk about a couple things. Maybe I will.
Sure.
One reason, I was going to do like a little article on why I am for big government and why I'm against big government, or why I'm for government and or what the role of government should be. And I had a thing I just posted on Facebook because there was all this, there was a lot of people saying that we should close the borders for Ebola and not let anybody from Western Africa countries come in to the United States, and then, so I just posted on Facebook saying, what would you do? Here's a list of things that you can do. You know, which choices would you make? And I'm surprised at the number of people, why the media is saying that we should close the borders, and they keep asking questions of everybody, of all the officials, you know, how are we closing the borders? But that's not what most of the people want to do, because they realize that you can't stop any diseases by just closing borders, or by taking temperatures of everybody, or lining people up and exposing them to each other while they're waiting to have their temperatures taken. How is that going to solve the problem? What you need is actually funding to help people to work on the diseases, biologists and chemists and doctors, and sending medical aid and finding a solution to it and stopping it, rather than calling the people that have it, or the people that are poor and more susceptible to diseases, as enemies. And so anyway, so government should not create wars, but they should be there to support situations, to put, our money should go toward finding a solution to things that are really a problem, like Ebola, or that thing, you know, that sort of thing, instead of creating things like, you know, we want your oil, we want your natural resources, therefore we're going to send troops over there to take them from you. And also that people say that they want to open up a coal mine here in Illinois, and the labor groups are saying, oh, but it'll be great jobs. Well, there's a difference between great jobs and just jobs. And you don't want to be working for something like that will destroy the environment, or that will create planes that will just be destroyed and scrapped, or be sent to the Champaign County, and we have this huge tank that we can't get rid of now. So there are good jobs, and then there are much better jobs that would actually be for long-lasting and good things too. And I think most labor people realize that, but then some people just want the military to, you know, the military is a great job. It's not.
Karen, have you heard the suggestion that the Ebola vaccine work on the Ebola vaccine in this country is being held up by groups that are dragging their feet until their rights to the material, that is getting paid for it, are established?
Seriously?
Yes,
wow.
Intellectual property intellectual property in the vaccine that actually protects against Ebola is being insisted upon by one group, and they're not proceeding with the development.
And that's why privatized industry does that.
Yes.
And the government shouldn't do that.
Exactly.
Right.
Shouldn't allow
Exactly.
that. Yeah.
You know, another interesting fact that's, of course, danced around by the corporate media. I had to sit in the waiting room last week for 20 minutes to be subjected to the nonstop hysteria propaganda coming off the television station, the CNN. I mean, just intentionally whipping up hysteria on this whole Ebola thing. Not once in that 20 minutes did I hear any of the newscasters or any of the guests they were interviewing talk about the only way you can get the Ebola virus if you're exposed to the body fluids of the victim. They were, not once did I hear that said. I mean, they were making it out, if you didn't know any better, you'd think it was like the common cold. But what's a real interesting fact that they danced around about was that this guy that came from West Africa and was in Texas, he was basically just a very superficial examination and released to the hospital because he didn't have health insurance.
Oh, is that
Yes,
right?
that's the fact they're trying to suppress. And what cued me in on it was when one of the talking heads on CNN goes, yes, and in our robust healthcare system here in the United States, the best in the world, I'm thinking, that's an interesting statement.
We deny it to all sorts of people.
Yeah, and then after a little digging and stuff and making a few inquiries, that's what I found out. And, you know, again, it's like there's money, plenty of money for Viagra, but it doesn't seem like there's money to do an Ebola vaccine that potentially could spread, I mean, beyond West Africa. And why do we send 3,000 combat troops to West Africa? Are they going to shoot germs? The Cubans, a small, lesser developed country, sent 165 doctors. I
Right.
mean, why aren't we sending doctors? I mean, why isn't the World Health Organization and the UN health organizations, I mean, sending a small army of doctors and technicians there to try to eliminate this at its source? I mean, it just seems like they're using this Ebola thing as a means to try to whip up hysteria for obtaining some type of political objective here. Kind of like what they tried to do back in the Bush administration with the bird flu. Remember, George W. Bush said that bird flu is going to spread here from Asia pretty quickly, and we're going to have to declare martial law and call in the military. It's like, what?
How would that solve anything?
Yes.
And people think that they can isolate themselves from the disease. And the only way you could possibly do that is if you lived in some remote place in Siberia or someplace. I mean, where you're not going to interact with anybody else.
But again, unless you touch the urine, the vomit, the feces, or the saliva or blood of an Ebola victim, you're not going to be infected.
Well, one thing I want to point out is that when I was in China in 2009, after a 18-hour flight back to China, we get off the plane, where we weren't allowed off the plane. Now, I don't know whether it was the SARS virus or one of them, but men in looked like hazmat suits came on, and they had something, they take our temperature on our forehead. So we were held up on the plane for at least 1 hour before we were allowed to leave. And we were segregated from those who had temperatures and those who did not. I did not have a temperature, but I have allergies. And so I'm sneezing and sneezing.
Right.
I was then pulled aside and sent off to be interviewed by a doctor, and once it was explained, that was okay, and I was back in with the group. And they actually had things set up so that there was a secondary control as we went through, that they were checking people's temperatures. But I was fine, but then we had other people who've been out of the country, came back, had temperatures. They were quarantined, but they were quarantined in very nice first-class hotels, and they were treated. They were treated medically for whatever problems they had. And only one was actually put into a hospital and treated. And this was done by the Chinese government. And there was never, as a result, China was very efficient at protecting their people from the spreading. It did not spread, it was just over there. So there are things that one can do, but the fact that we're mistreating people, and as you pointed out, David, it's likely this guy was released simply because he did not have health insurance. That certainly was not an issue in China.
I was interested in coming through the Beijing airport recently, and this past May, immensely crowded Beijing airport. I mean, people, it was a mad scene of numbers of people, but one of the things that we went through was a little archway, which took the temperature of everyone who came through.
And
So that everyone in the airport, they took a reading on, and with the idea of people who are actually running a fever, were taken aside, and because there was concern about things that might spread. And this was actually pre the Ebola hysteria, but it was clearly a regular policy of the Chinese authorities. Did you all see, by the way, that the Russian health minister announced on Monday that they had a Ebola vaccine in the works, and that they were going to be testing it in Guinea in the next 2 months, and that their preliminary results showed a 70 to 90% effectiveness for their vaccine. Now, the intellectual property, to put it in the to use the euphemism, the intellectual property issue doesn't seem to be a concern for the Russians here. They say they have a vaccine that has some usefulness, and they're going to try to use it. While we're sending troops to West Africa, they're sending a vaccine.
Right.
Where did you get this information, Carl?
It was in the press yesterday. As a matter of fact, the excellent website Mashable carried an account that I'm looking at right now.
Oh, so you didn't get this off CNN?
No, CNN may have mentioned it, because the initial announcement was by Russian Deputy Prime Minister for Social Affairs, Olga Golodets, in a press conference on Monday. So I mean, it's out there, so to speak, but it has not been much bruited about by any means. You're watching Aware on the Air. We have some comments now on things that have been said so far this evening, and I think it's David's turn. If you want to comment on other things said on the panel tonight.
Okay. Boy, Karen hit a couple of real good points. What were you talking about before the Ebola thing? A government, and then there was something else?
Oh, good question.
There's this unpleasantness in the Middle East, I mean, that you were talking about, David.
Good reasons for government and bad things that government shouldn't do and things that government should do.
Boy, that'd be a...
Right.
But also jobs, but the jobs.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. You know, I learned a long time ago that, you know, using the euphemism, you shouldn't urinate in your own nest. And I mean, you know, that's the way I look at jobs and the environment. I mean, if you know, again, you know, the corporate powers that be are trying to, you know, take advantage of desperate people, especially over in Vermilion County,
Yeah.
where the unemployment rate's a lot higher and the poverty rate's a lot higher. People are desperate for any kind of halfway decent paying job, but I mean, you know, it's just not sustainable. You shouldn't be having jobs that cause problems like you know, polluting groundwater that everybody drinks, you know, or deforesting areas or whatever. I mean, you can have jobs, you can have economy with growth. It just has to be done intelligently, and it has to be done looking to the future. I mean, let's face it, coal is. You know, it needs to be phased out. I mean, and why is it that you know, why is it all this money that our government spends? I mean, man, how much money did they cough up for the Ukrainian government back you know, last summer? I mean, just in the blink of an eye. You know, and they seem to always be able to find money for this or that, as far as you know, various dubious foreign policy interventions or military things. But you know, where's the money to invest in you know, solar, to expand solar and wind power to the average American? I mean, there'd be a great public works program that I've actually thought about and you know, kind of wrote things about it a while back, several years ago, about, you know, one great thing to do, you know, if we had another economic downturn, was for the federal government to basically finance the placement of solar panels and a wind generator on every single federal the state building in the United States, as well as every single public school. Can you imagine how much jobs that would create, as well as you know, the potential you know, energy you know, independence, as well as the health for our environment that would you know, kick off. I mean, but it seems like none of this is done. I mean, yet we're still giving money to the oil, you know, and natural gas and coal industry, as far as subsidies.
We don't need that, David. We got fracking.
Oh yes, of course.
Right, fracking.
Again, poisoning groundwater and, you know, earthquakes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we need, more of those.
Well, it's just like climate change. Here we are, instead of looking at, you know, job creation, looking at energy alternatives, looking at health care, we're looking at military overseas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Right.
supporting, propping up dictatorial, human rights
Right.
abusive governments. The three largest recipients of foreign military aid is Colombia, Egypt, and Israel. I mean, wow. I can think a lot better uses for our tax dollars than that sort of thing.
Did you notice this week, too, that the price of oil fell to the lowest level in some time, in part due to fracking and the shale oil revolution in this country? And that is of great interest to the Obama administration precisely because it hurts Russia. The Russian economy, which is, you know, much smaller, of course, than the economy of the United States, the Russian economy depends upon oil. It's their energy independence of the Russian economy that has underwritten the reforms of the Putin era. And the U.S., by drawing down the price of oil, and it does that, first of all, by the shale oil in this country, but also by using one of its principal Middle East clients, Saudi Arabia, in terms of increasing the amount of oil flow in the world, brings the price down and hopes to do damage to Putin's operation. This isn't an accident. Energy policy is closely bound up with what the U.S. is doing, not only in the Middle East, but in the entire Eurasian competition the pivot to Asia,
Right.
Asia that we've been talking about before.
On
Karen,
that
go ahead.
topic, I will simply say that November 24th is the meeting with Tehran,
Yes.
and this is going to be very heavy. Pepe Escobar was just there, and he said there are 3 overarching themes monopolizing all important discussions. 1, the real possibility of a nuclear deal. 2, the end of sanctions and the possibility of Iran soon starting to supply the EU with loads of natural gas. And 3, the fight against ISIS. Okay, now there's a lot of talk here, a lot of discussion, but at the end what he pretty much says is that the fact remains Washington needs Moscow as well as Beijing for a nuclear agreement with Iran to be enshrined on November 24th. There is no evidence so far that Tehran will renounce its political clout and nuclear energy independence just to trade with the West. And there's no evidence Moscow will allow itself to be undercut by Tehran. So, in fact, mutual cooperation is the norm. President Rouhani just met President Putin during the 4th summit, and he says, Rouhani emphasized the Caspian should become a symbol of cooperation and peaceful development. So, no pitting of Tehran against Moscow, much to Washington's displeasure. But the stakes couldn't be higher right now.
Thank you, Karen. Ron, do you have a concluding comment?
There are several things that I could say. One of the underlying factors, I think, here is the short-term perspective that our economic system forces upon a lot of people. You have to always be thinking about the next election or the quarterly report of the corporation that you're serving and so on. This prevents any longer-term perspectives, and some say, and prevents us from making longer-term plans about the future and overcoming some of these things that have been talked about here.
So you're saying,
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 42nd week of 2014. Thanks to Jason Liggett for direction and production. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see our Facebook page, see the Facebook page for Aware. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. We can add James Risen's name on that, too. Now, this is Carl Esterbrook for Karen Aram, Ron Zote, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, David Green, Yakov Ziso, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.